A man falls in love with you for only two reasons Carl Jung imagined sitting across from someone you thought you knew, someone whose eyes once held promises of forever, whose touch once felt like home, only to discover that the person they fell in love with was never really you at all. The realization hits like a cold wind through an open window. You were simply a canvas onto which they painted their deepest longings, their unresolved wounds, their most desperate fantasies of what love should be. This moment of devastating clarity isn't just about one relationship gone wrong. It's about a fundamental truth that Carl Jung spent decades uncovering, a truth so unsettling that most people spend their entire lives running from it. The truth is this: when a man falls in love with you, he's not falling in love with who you actually are. He's falling in love with one of two profound psychological phenomena that have nothing to do with your authentic self and everything to do with the hidden architecture of his unconscious mind. Picture this. You're in what feels like the perfect relationship. He tells you you're different from all the others. He says he's never felt this way before. His eyes light up when he sees you, and he seems to hang on your every word. You feel chosen, special, irreplaceable. But then, gradually or suddenly, something shifts. The same qualities he once adored become sources of irritation. The spontaneity he praised becomes unpredictability he can't handle. The independence he found attractive becomes distance he can't bridge. The very essence of who you are, the traits that make you uniquely you, seem to dissolve before his eyes, replaced by disappointment, confusion, or worse, indifference. What happened? Did you change? Did he? Or was there something far more complex and disturbing at play? Something that reveals not just the fragility of modern romance, but the deep psychological mechanisms that drive human attraction itself. Jung's revolutionary insight cuts through centuries of romantic mythology to reveal a truth that most people aren't prepared to face: authentic love, the kind that sees and accepts another person for who they truly are, is extraordinarily rare. Instead, what we call falling in love is usually one of two psychological projections, each rooted in the deepest layers of the masculine psyche, each powerful enough to create the illusion of destiny while simultaneously ensuring the relationship's eventual dissolution. The first reason a man falls in love has to do with what Jung called the anima, the feminine aspect of his unconscious that he's spent his entire life either suppressing or idealizing. When he meets you, he doesn't see you. He sees the living embodiment of everything he believes he needs to become whole, complete, spiritually fulfilled. You become his missing piece, his salvation, his gateway to the parts of himself he's lost or never developed. The intensity feels cosmic because, in a sense, he's projecting onto you the power to heal decades of inner fragmentation. The second reason is even more complex and potentially devastating. It involves what Jung understood about the shadow, those rejected, denied, or undeveloped aspects of personality that every person carries in their unconscious. When a man falls in love with you for this reason, you represent not what he wants to become, but what he unconsciously needs to resolve, control, or possess. You embody some aspect of his own rejected self that he can neither accept nor ignore. The attraction feels irresistible because he's drawn to you like a moth to flame, compelled by forces he doesn't understand to engage with parts of himself he spent years avoiding. But here's what makes this knowledge both liberating and terrifying. Neither of these reasons has anything to do with you as an individual human being with your own dreams, fears, complexities, and authentic nature. You could be anyone. You could be someone completely different. As long as you fit the psychological template his unconscious is seeking, the same intensity, the same conviction of destiny, the same overwhelming sense of rightness would occur. This isn't cynicism. It's the beginning of real understanding. Because once you grasp these hidden mechanisms, once you see how projection masquerades as love, you gain access to something infinitely more valuable than being chosen for reasons you don't understand. You gain the power to recognize genuine recognition when it finally appears. You develop the ability to distinguish between being loved for who you are and being loved for who someone needs you to be. The question that emerges from this realization isn't whether you can make someone love the real you. It's whether you're brave enough to stop participating in relationships where love is conditional on your willingness to remain a projection screen for someone else's psychological needs. Are you ready to discover why this pattern has shaped your relationships in ways you never realized? Are you prepared to understand the invisible forces that determine whether a man sees you or simply sees what he needs to see? Because what comes next will change not just how you understand romantic attraction, but how you understand the very nature of human connection itself. To understand why these projections feel so real, so undeniably true, we must descend into the psychological underworld that Jung spent his lifetime mapping. A realm where the individual psyche meets the collective unconscious, where personal wounds intersect with archetypal patterns that have shaped human behavior for millennia. The first projection, the Anima projection, emerges from what Jung identified as one of the most profound tragedies of modern masculine development: the systematic disconnection from the feminine principle within. From childhood, boys learn that to be accepted as men, they must reject anything deemed feminine: emotion, intuition, receptivity, vulnerability, creative flow. These qualities don't disappear. They become unconscious, creating an inner feminine figure that Jung called the Anima. This isn't about gender in the conventional sense. It's about psychological wholeness. The Anima represents all the undeveloped potential within a man's psyche, everything he's been taught to suppress or deny. She exists in his unconscious as a powerful, often idealized figure. Sometimes the perfect woman who will complete him, sometimes the wise goddess who will guide him to enlightenment, sometimes the muse who will unlock his creative potential. When a man encounters a woman who embodies his Anima projection, the recognition feels supernatural. She seems to radiate exactly what he's been missing. Her laugh unlocks something in his chest he didn't know was closed. Her way of seeing the world illuminates corners of reality he'd forgotten existed. Her presence makes him feel more creative, more alive, more connected to some essential part of himself that society taught him to abandon. But here's the psychological trap. He's not falling in love with her. He's falling in love with his own disowned femininity that he perceives in her. She becomes responsible for carrying all the emotional, intuitive, and creative aspects of life that he never learned to develop in himself. The relationship becomes a desperate attempt to access his own wholeness through another person, a psychological dependency disguised as destiny. Friedrich Nietzsche, long before Jung, understood this dynamic when he wrote about the danger of seeking completion through others. In Beyond Good and Evil, he warned that love often masks a profound selfishness, the need to possess in another what we lack in ourselves. The beloved becomes not a separate person with her own inner world, but an object that exists to fulfill our psychological incompleteness. The second projection, what we might call the shadow projection, operates through an even more complex mechanism. Jung discovered that every person carries within their unconscious all the qualities, impulses, and potentials they've rejected about themselves. This shadow doesn't simply disappear when we deny it. It becomes autonomous, seeking expression through projection onto others. When a man falls in love through shadow projection, he's unconsciously attracted to a woman who embodies aspects of his own denied self. If he spent his life being responsible and controlled, he might be irresistibly drawn to a woman who seems wild and unpredictable. If he suppressed his own vulnerability, he might find himself obsessed with someone who seems emotionally open and unguarded. If he's denied his own creativity or unconventionality, he might become captivated by a woman who lives outside social expectations. The attraction feels profound because he's encountering parts of himself that have been banished to the unconscious. Through her, he gets to experience vicarious freedom, vicarious authenticity, vicarious aliveness. She becomes his secret pathway to the forbidden territories of his own psyche. Arthur Schopenhauer anticipated this understanding in his analysis of sexual attraction. arguing that what we call love is often the unconscious mind's attempt to achieve psychological balance through union with another. The individual believes they're choosing based on personal preference, but they're actually being driven by deeper psychological forces seeking equilibrium. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Nazi concentration camps and founder of logotherapy, observed how people often seek meaning through romantic relationships when they've lost connection to their own sense of purpose. The beloved becomes not just a person, but a meaning-making system, a reason for existence, a defense against the fundamental anxiety of being responsible for one's own life. But perhaps Jean-Paul Sartre captured the essential tragedy most clearly in his concept of bad faith, the ways we deceive ourselves to avoid confronting the full weight of our freedom and responsibility. When we fall in love through projection, we're engaging in a sophisticated form of bad faith, convincing ourselves that another person holds the key to our completeness while avoiding the more difficult work of developing ourselves. The cultural forces that perpetuate these patterns run deeper than individual psychology. We live in a society that has largely abandoned traditional initiation rituals, the ceremonies and challenges that once guided men through the development of mature masculinity. Without these rites of passage, many men remain psychologically adolescent, seeking through romantic relationships the guidance, validation, and completion that healthy initiation would have provided. Modern capitalism compounds this by turning everything, including relationships, into commodities to be consumed rather than sacred bonds to be honored. The anima becomes the perfect woman to be found and possessed. The shadow becomes the exciting experience to be captured and controlled. Love becomes another form of acquisition rather than a path to mutual growth and recognition. This is why the pattern repeats. Why the same man can move from relationship to relationship, each time convinced he's found the one, each time eventually disillusioned when the woman fails to fulfill her impossible role as his psychological completion. The problem isn't with the women, it's with a system of relating that confuses projection with perception, dependency with love, psychological need with genuine recognition. The question that emerges isn't whether these projections will occur. They're virtually inevitable given how most people develop psychologically. The question is whether the people involved have enough self-awareness to recognize what's happening and enough courage to choose something different. The devastating power of these projections lies not in their initial intensity, but in how they systematically reshape reality for everyone involved, creating invisible prisons that feel like palaces until the walls begin to close in. The consequences ripple outward in ways that most people never recognize, affecting not just romantic relationships, but the fundamental capacity for authentic human connection. Consider what happens to a woman when she becomes the repository for a man's anima projection. Initially, she feels elevated, chosen, seen in ways that seem almost mystical. He notices things about her that others miss. He celebrates qualities in her that previous partners overlooked or criticized. She begins to inhabit this idealized version of herself, unconsciously molding her behavior to match his projection because the reflection feels so intoxicating, so validating. But here's where the psychological trap snaps shut. She starts to lose access to parts of herself that don't fit the projection. If his anima needs her to be ethereal and wise, she begins suppressing her moments of confusion or practical concern. If his projection requires her to be emotionally available and nurturing, she learns to hide her own needs for support or her occasional desire for solitude. She becomes complicit in her own erasure, trading authenticity for the drug-like high of being seen as perfect. Neurologically, this process creates what researchers call intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive pattern of reward known to psychology. Sometimes she receives the incredible validation of matching his projection perfectly. Other times, when her authentic self emerges in conflicts with his unconscious expectations, she experiences his confusion, disappointment, or withdrawal. Her nervous system becomes wired to chase the highs and avoid the lows, creating an addiction to being someone she's not. The cognitive bias at work here is what psychologists term confirmation bias on steroids. His brain actively filters reality to maintain the projection, noticing only evidence that supports his unconscious fantasy while dismissing or reinterpreting anything that contradicts it. When she acts in ways that don't fit his anima projection, he doesn't think, "I was wrong about who she is." Instead, he thinks she's changed, or she's not being her true self, or something's wrong with her. This creates a profound form of gaslighting that neither person consciously intends. She begins to question her own perceptions, her own needs, her own reality. If the man she loves, the man who seemed to see her so clearly, is now confused or disappointed by her authentic responses, maybe she really is being unreasonable, too demanding, not feminine enough, not understanding enough. The shadow projection creates even more complex psychological damage. When a man is unconsciously attracted to a woman who represents his rejected aspects, the relationship becomes a battleground between fascination and control. He's drawn to her wildness but wants to tame it. He's captivated by her emotional openness but needs to manage it. He's intrigued by her unconventionality but requires her to fit into his acceptable social framework. The woman becomes trapped in an impossible double bind. She's loved for qualities that her partner simultaneously needs to change. If she maintains the very characteristics that attracted him, she's too much, too emotional, too free, too unpredictable. If she adapts to become more acceptable, she's not the same person he fell in love with. Either choice leads to his unconscious resentment and her growing sense of psychological fragmentation. Cultural conditioning amplifies these dynamics through what sociologists call gender performance expectations. Women are taught from childhood to be accommodating, to prioritize relationships over individual authenticity, to find their value through being chosen and cherished by others. Men are conditioned to see women as either idealized feminine principles or as problems to be solved rather than as complete human beings with their own inner worlds. The result is an entire generation of people who mistake intensity for intimacy, projection for perception, psychological dependency for love. They move through relationships, creating elaborate theatrical productions where everyone is playing roles that prevent genuine connection. The anima-projected woman becomes the eternal feminine archetype. The shadow-projected woman becomes the fascinating problem. Neither gets to be simply human. But the most insidious consequence may be how these patterns affect a woman's relationship with her own intuition. When someone consistently misperceives you through the lens of their psychological needs, you begin to doubt your own ability to read situations accurately. If his projection makes him see you as more wise/nurturing/mysterious than you feel, you start questioning whether you know yourself at all. If his shadow projection makes him react to you as if you're more dangerous/overwhelming/chaotic than you experience yourself to be, you begin to wonder if there's something fundamentally wrong with your way of being in the world. This erosion of self-trust has far-reaching implications beyond romantic relationships. It affects career decisions, friendships, parenting choices, creative expression, every area where authentic self-knowledge is essential for healthy functioning. Women who have repeatedly been loved for projections rather than recognition often struggle to distinguish between their genuine preferences and the adaptations they've made to maintain others' fantasies about them. The societal cost is immeasurable. We've created a culture where genuine intimacy, the kind that requires seeing and accepting another person's full humanity, becomes increasingly rare. Instead, we have projection addiction. People seeking relationships not for mutual growth and companionship, but for the psychological services that partners provide through carrying our disowned aspects. Children raised in these projection-based relationships absorb these patterns as normal, learning that love is conditional on being what others need rather than expressing who they authentically are. They grow up believing that being seen accurately is either impossible or undesirable, that real love requires the sacrifice of selfhood. Perhaps most tragically, both people in projection-based relationships miss the profound gift that genuine recognition offers. The experience of being loved, not for who someone needs you to be, but for who you actually are, including your contradictions, your growth edges, your humanness. They mistake the intensity of psychological dependency for depth of connection, never discovering what it feels like to be loved by someone who sees them clearly and chooses them anyway. The pattern perpetuates because it feels so meaningful, so destined, so profound in its intensity. But intensity isn't intimacy. Projection isn't perception, and psychological need, no matter how powerful, isn't love. The question becomes, if these patterns are so deeply embedded in both individual psychology and cultural conditioning, is there any way to break free? Can people learn to love and be loved for who they actually are rather than for the roles they play in others' psychological dramas? The path to freedom begins with a radical act of rebellion against everything you've been taught about love, worthiness, and what it means to be chosen. This rebellion isn't loud or dramatic. It's a quiet, revolutionary decision to stop participating in your own erasure, to refuse the seductive but hollow validation that comes from being someone's projection screen. The first step is learning to recognize projection in real time, and this requires developing what Jung called active imagination, the ability to observe your own psychological processes with scientific curiosity rather than emotional reactivity. When someone seems instantly fascinated by you, when they claim you're different from everyone else, when they seem to see qualities in you that feel slightly exaggerated or idealized, you're likely encountering projection. The test is simple but difficult. Notice how you feel when you're with them. Are you performing a slightly enhanced version of yourself? Are you unconsciously editing out aspects of your personality that might disrupt their perception? Are you finding yourself more agreeable, more mysterious, more nurturing, or more free-spirited than you naturally are? If so, you're not being seen. You're being used as a canvas for someone else's psychological artwork. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, spent decades studying how people break free from archetypal projections. She discovered that liberation requires what she called withdrawing projections, consciously recognizing that the intense feelings someone has for you often have nothing to do with who you actually are. This isn't cynical, it's liberating. It means their eventual disappointment or loss of interest isn't a reflection of your worth. It's the inevitable result of reality conflicting with fantasy. But withdrawal of projections must be accompanied by something far more challenging: the development of your own psychological wholeness. You cannot attract authentic recognition until you become authentically recognizable, and this requires reclaiming all the aspects of yourself that you've learned to hide, deny, or modify for others' comfort. Consider the historical example of George Sand, the 19th century French novelist who refused to play any version of femininity that society expected. She wore men's clothing, smoked cigars, had affairs with both men and women, wrote under a masculine pseudonym, and lived entirely according to her own authentic nature. The men who fell in love with her, including Chopin and de Musset, initially were attracted to her unconventionality, but then spent years trying to tame her, normalize her, make her fit their projections of what a woman should be. Her rebellion was refusing to change, refusing to become smaller or more acceptable, even when it meant losing relationships that felt significant. Sand understood something that most people never learn. Being loved for who you pretend to be is worse than being alone, because it requires the constant murder of your authentic self. Her relationships ended, but her integrity remained intact, and eventually she attracted people who could love her complexity rather than needing to resolve it. The modern version of this rebellion involves what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to maintain your authentic self even in the face of others' projections, expectations, or disappointments. It means developing an internal validation system so strong that external validation becomes interesting but not necessary. This process requires grieving the loss of the fantasy that someone will love you so perfectly that you'll never have to do the difficult work of loving yourself. It means accepting that most people are psychologically unprepared for authentic intimacy, and that their inability to see you clearly isn't your responsibility to fix. But here's the counterintuitive truth that emerges from this rebellion. When you stop trying to be lovable and start being authentic, you become magnetic in an entirely different way. Instead of attracting people who need you to fulfill their projections, you begin attracting people who are intrigued by your realness, your complexity, your refusal to be easily categorized or controlled. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face-to-face encounter, moments when we see another person not through the filter of our needs or projections, but in their irreducible otherness. These encounters are rare because they require what he called ethical infinity, the willingness to let another person remain mysterious, unknowable, beyond our control or complete understanding. Women who break free from projection-based relationships often go through what therapists call the dark night of the soul, a period where they feel invisible, unchosen, fundamentally unlovable. This isn't depression. It's withdrawal from the drug of being someone's fantasy. The authentic self, when it first emerges from years of performing projected roles, can feel raw, uncertain, less immediately appealing than the polished personas that attracted projection. But this awkward, vulnerable authenticity is the doorway to genuine connection. When you stop being what others need and start being who you are, the quality of your relationships transforms completely. You attract fewer people, but the connections are deeper, more durable, based on actual recognition rather than psychological dependency. The rebellion also requires learning to love your own contradictions. The ways you're simultaneously strong and vulnerable, wise and confused, generous and selfish, conventional and wild. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites. And it's essential for breaking free from projection because projections always require you to be one-dimensional, the perfect anima figure or the fascinating shadow figure, but never the full complexity of a real human being. When you embody your own contradictions consciously, you become unprojectable. People can't use you as a screen for their psychological needs because you're too three-dimensional, too obviously real and complex. This doesn't make you less attractive. It makes you attractive to different people who are psychologically mature enough to be intrigued by complexity rather than needing to simplify it. The ultimate rebellion is this: choosing to be seen accurately rather than being seen favorably. It's the decision to value recognition over validation, depth over intensity, authenticity over approval. It's scary because it means releasing control over how others perceive you and trusting that being real is more valuable than being perfect. But for those brave enough to attempt this rebellion, something extraordinary awaits. The possibility of being loved not for who someone needs you to be, but for who you actually are. The deepest truth that emerges from understanding these projections isn't about men or women, isn't about romantic relationships or psychological theory. It's about the fundamental choice that every human being faces, whether to live as a character in other people's stories or as the author of your own existence. Jung spent his final years exploring what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are rather than who others need you to be. He discovered that most people never individuate. They remain collections of roles, projections, and adaptations, never discovering their authentic core. But for those who dare to undertake this journey, a profound transformation becomes possible. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. The reason projections feel so compelling, so destined, so meaningful, is that they contain fragments of truth. When a man projects his anima onto you, he's not entirely wrong. You do carry feminine wisdom, intuitive knowing, creative potential. When he projects his shadow onto you, he's not completely mistaken. You do embody aspects of freedom, authenticity, or emotional depth that he's denied in himself. The projection isn't false, it's incomplete. It sees part of who you are and mistakes it for the whole. It recognizes genuine qualities, but distorts them through the lens of psychological need. The tragedy isn't that men see nothing real in women. It's that they see fragments of reality and believe they're seeing the complete picture. But here's the revelation that transforms everything. When you stop trying to fulfill these projections and start embodying the fullness of who you are, something miraculous happens. The same qualities that attracted projection begin attracting recognition. The difference is subtle but world-changing. Projection says, "You are my missing piece, my salvation, my completion." Recognition says, "You are remarkably yourself, and I find myself curious about who that is." Projection requires you to remain static, to continue being whatever triggered the initial attraction. Recognition celebrates your growth, your contradictions, your evolving humanity. Projection loves you for what you can provide. Recognition loves you for who you are becoming. The ultimate truth is this: authentic love isn't about being chosen, it's about being seen. And being seen requires that you first become visible, which means inhabiting your full complexity rather than editing yourself for others' comfort. Marie Curie understood this when she refused to dim her intellectual brilliance to make men more comfortable with her success. Virginia Woolf embodied it when she wrote about the necessity of having a room of one's own, physical and psychological space where a woman could exist without performing for others. Maya Angelou lived it when she declared, "If you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude." Each of these women attracted both projection and recognition throughout their lives. The difference wasn't in the men who approached them. It was in their own relationship to authenticity. When they performed projected roles, they received projection-based love. When they inhabited their full selves, they occasionally encountered people capable of genuine recognition. But perhaps the most profound realization is this: you don't need to be recognized by everyone. You don't even need to be recognized by most people. You only need to be recognizable, to live with such authenticity that when someone capable of genuine seeing encounters you, recognition becomes possible. This understanding liberates you from the exhausting project of trying to be universally lovable. Instead of asking, "How can I make him see me?" you begin asking, "How can I become more fully myself?" Instead of wondering, "Why does he love me for the wrong reasons?" you start exploring, "What would it feel like to love myself for the right reasons?" The shift is seismic. You stop being a victim of others' projections and become a participant in your own recognition. You realize that every time someone projects onto you, you have a choice: collaborate with their fantasy or remain loyal to your reality. Every time someone tries to love you for who they need you to be, you can either perform that role or demonstrate who you actually are. Jung's final insight cuts to the heart of human existence. We are all seeking the same thing: to be known, understood, accepted in our full humanity. But most people seek this recognition through projection, trying to find themselves in others rather than developing themselves within. They mistake intensity for intimacy, dependency for love, fantasy for reality. The few who dare to individuate, to become authentically themselves, discover something extraordinary. Genuine recognition is possible, but only between people who have done the work of becoming recognizable. It's not about finding someone who sees you perfectly. It's about becoming someone worth seeing clearly. This is why the 2 reasons men fall in love with you are ultimately invitations to transcend the very system that creates them. Every Anima projection is an opportunity to demonstrate that you're more complex than any archetype. Every shadow projection is a chance to show that you're more than someone else's disowned aspects. When you stop participating in your own objectification, when you refuse to be the feminine principle, the fascinating problem, the missing piece, or the salvation, you create space for something unprecedented: the possibility of being loved as a complete human being by another complete human being. The ultimate truth isn't that men fall in love with you for only 2 reasons. It's that there's a 3rd reason rarer and more precious than the others. They fall in love with you because you are irreducibly, mysteriously, authentically yourself, and they have developed the psychological maturity to find that selfhood beautiful rather than threatening. This third way of being loved requires everything of you: the courage to disappoint, the strength to be misunderstood, the faith that authenticity is more valuable than approval. But for those who choose this path, love becomes not a loss of self, but a celebration of self. Not a merger, but a meeting. Not a completion, but a recognition of two whole people choosing to share their wholeness. The question that remains isn't whether you'll be loved. It's whether you'll be yourself long enough, courageously enough, completely enough to discover what recognition feels like when it finally finds you.